Hello everyone. Today we are discussing the verbal section of your first Anubhav CSAT test. Manjul sir has already discussed the maths and reasoning questions. I'll be covering your verbal or passage questions. Many of you have attended my classes before, so you do know how the method we follow for solving these questions. Some of you may be new and may not know this method, so please be sure to follow the method closely. There will be parts of the discussion today where I'll discuss inference and assumption questions. I'll discuss the background or the concept of the inference question and of the assumption question. There are a few other so-called technical questions that I'll discuss sort of slowly. And that's because I have interacted with a number of students and I know that these questions, or at least the concepts of these questions, still present some challenges. All right. So I know all of you all have seen the paper before. You've solved the paper before. So I would rate the paper as, like, in terms of the passage section, as easy to moderate. That's because there were maybe three passages with three questions, which can be considered difficult, but the rest of the passages and the questions were moderate or easy. So, broadly speaking, the paper was easy to moderate. Most of us could solve these questions, and our accuracy could be close to 100%. So, those of you who found the overall Anubhav paper challenging, I want you to consider whether you spent enough time in evaluating whether you should solve passages. How many passages did you solve? Did you solve maybe just 10 odd passages, or did you go and solve the complete 26 questions? All right. So, let's look at the instructions. The important thing for all of us to remember that our answers should be based on the passage only. What happens is, जब time कम पढ़ने लग जाएगा, or we are rereading things too often, we tend to jump to the options. So let me get to the broad methodology of solving. You want to trust the passage fully because this is written by the author, and we have to figure out the main point of the passage first, right? This is step one. Only after we have read the passage carefully and figured out its main point, then should we go to the questions and the option. All right. So let me show you one passage here. Uh, Look at the first passage. The first thing that I want you to read is the question stem, right? This is what we call the question stem. The reason why we read the question stem before reading the passage or the options is we know what is expected from the question, so we know how to read the passage. Okay, let's get back to this discussion. So, as I was saying, I read the passage first after reading the question stem, figure out what's to be done, and understand the main point of the author. Only then I proceed to the options. If I jump to the options too soon, if I try and rush through the reading process of the passage, then what happens is many times the answers are based on what I know, or I'm trying to solve these or figure out these options based on memory. That's not good. We want to treat this passage solving exercise like we are solving a bar graph question. We don't try and memorize the bar graph. Uh, and we first figure out what's on the x-axis, y-axis, and then we go to the questions, right? So don't use your memory. First figure out what is given here and then go to the question part. This is what we do with passages as well. This is our broad speaking method. All right. We'll go through each passage word by word, a few instructions. There's no point me rereading the full passage. I know most of you have solved all the passages. So, what I've done is I've marked only those words which, like I've mentioned in classes before, which will indicate exactly the main point of the author to us. All right. Those just reading these words, for example, we'll read the first passage. We know we're looking for an implication here, right? That's what we read first. Best implied is what we're looking for. उसके बाद वी गो टू द पैसेज में वी आर टोल्ड बायोसेफ्टी और बायोसिक्योरिटी में एक डिस्टिंक्शन द ऑथर इज ट्राइंग टू ड्रॉ राइट डिस्टिंक्शन इज बायोसेफ्टी इज अबाउट बैड insects bugs biosecurity is about people misusing those bad insects or bugs biosecurity is the risk of weaponization especially in India का रीजन क्या है ease of access to biological agents All right. So the main point of the passage was to show us a distinction between biosafety and biosecurity and why this is especially problematic in India because of ease of access to biological agents. Also, rival nations could create problems. All right. So we understand the main point of the author. Now, best implied. Okay. So give me one brief moment to discuss inferences. Now, there is a very slight distinction or difference between inferences, implication, conclusion, etc. But we'll all treat this as one for the sake of our discussion today and for the sake of the exam. All right. So, an inference is when we reach a conclusion based on some evidence, right? So suppose the evidence you had was this is the example that students from the classroom will remember. Suppose you step outside your house and you see dark clouds in the sky and you see water in the streets. You will put both of these facts together and you'll infer that it has rained in the past. It has just rained, right? This is what we would infer. So an inference or an implication or a conclusion here is us using some pieces of evidence. This is the important part. Us using one or more pieces of evidence to reach a conclusion. Correct? That's what an inference or implication is. Now let's go back to the question. Uh, I've discussed in classes how to read options really carefully and remember to have maximum possible accuracy for each option that you're saying is negated. Like if I say option A is invalid, for each option I'm invalidating, I'm not saying that this option doesn't sound right or doesn't feel right because that will lead to inaccuracies. I'm relying on evidence, correct? So I'm looking at specific words which could not be implied from the passage. India is currently ill equipped to detect or respond to threats arising from either biosafety or biosecurity. So I know these exact words, India is currently ill equipped, cannot be valid implications. It's an invalid inference or it's an invalid implication. It's because India's current thing, we are clearly facing the risk of biosecurity, but it's not telling us whether it's ill equipped or not ill equipped, right? Okay, so A is invalid. Let's look at option B. India's biosecurity policy should help us develop strategies to respond to threats at a national level, right? So we are told risk of weaponization is high, especially in India. Now, this is the implication or inference. We need to make a fresh conclusion. India's biosecurity policy should help us develop strategies is a valid implication or inference. Let me get back to option B. I'll tell you why it's valid. First, let's look at why C and D are invalid. C tells us India has impacted its rival nations in terms of biosecurity threat profile. India's biosecurity threat profile has impacted capacity of its rival nations. So India has impacted rival nations has not been discussed in the passage. India could be impacted by rival nations. Rival nations could act as a threat to India. This has been discussed. So option C is actually stating the opposite of what is stated in the last line. Again, a factual error. I've marked the exact words why option C is invalid. Option D says India is vulnerable due to its high population. Now we know this is obviously invalid. So the really important part I want all of you all to keep in mind, and this is what we'll follow throughout our discussion today. This is what I want you to follow in the exam is be specific about why an option is correct or incorrect. Don't generally describe it internally to yourself. It will lead to errors. Option B says India's biosecurity policy. These words, even if these words weren't there, India's policy should help us develop strategies. This would have still been correct. India should help us develop strategies. This also would still be correct. So these words, India's biosecurity policy, are a valid implication because India should develop a policy to reduce the risk of weaponization. All right. So the right choice for the first question would be option B. Let's look at question number 2. Question number 2 is looking for inferences. Here, the main point is that there is some area of collaboration between polar studies and the Himalayas and how this is beneficial for India. Thus, India's Arctic policy is expected to facilitate comparative scientific studies. So, India is expected to do some comparative scientific studies that will help its analysis of the Himalayas, but using polar studies. All right. So we are looking for inferences. I've already discussed what inferences are. Let's look at the first option. The IAP will analyze and predict the effects of ice melting on India's economic and military. So predict effects on military has nowhere been discussed. This would be an invalid inference. If you remember, we needed evidence for each conclusion that we made, right? For it rained, we needed both dark clouds and water in the streets. If we just had water in the streets, we can't say it rained. Or if we just had dark clouds, we can't say it's rained. So we needed both. The same way, here, we don't have anything to suggest that this prediction is going to affect India's military capacities from the passage, right? So option A is invalid. Let's look at option B. Option B tells us the IAP can be reasonably placed within India's science diplomacy policy. Can be placed within science diplomacy. Science diplomacy not discussed in the passage beyond scope of the passage. Option B is invalid. India has vital stakes in terms of collaboration. So we are told here clearly, thus India's policy is expected to facilitate comparative scientific study. Is expected tells us this is needed. Has been significantly enhanced. So we are told there is an ecological need also. So vital stakes is valid. In terms of collaboration, we are discussing comparative studies and collaboration. For understanding Himalayan glacier retreat, option C is a valid choice. No words are such that we can't infer them from the passage. And in D says India has no choice but to collaborate. अब no choice तो कहीं पे भी passage में कहा नहीं है. It's told that it's important to collaborate, but no choice has not been discussed. So option D is invalid. Let's look at question 3. According to the passage, which of the following is are true? Is are true is usually a straightforward factual question, or these statements could be inferences, right? We are told reasons for undernutrition. It goes beyond calories, deficiencies in energy, protein, or essential vitamins and minerals. This is told to us. And we are told that these in turn are caused by a range of factors, including inadequacy. So, undernutrition is caused due to inadequacy in childcare, inadequacy in healthcare, etc. etc. So, we know the passage. I've captured some words which will indicate the main point. We can include more words, of course. I want to capture the main point in as few words as possible, at least for the discussion of the passage, and also for reading efficiency in the exam. Okay, let's look at statement 1, lack of adequate care during childhood. Now we know lack of adequate care is discussed here. Undernutrition is a result of inadequate intake, etc. etc. These in turn, so all of these issues in turn are caused by inadequate child care. So lack of adequate care during childhood, inadequate child care. Statement 1 is valid. Now, statement 2 says illnesses such as diarrhea can cause undernutrition. We are told in the second sentence, undernutrition is a result of inadequate intake of food, poor utilization of nutrients due to infections or other illnesses. Now, infections or other illnesses does not specifically include diarrhea, right? It may or may not include diarrhea. It's not discussed in the passage. So statement 2 is invalid. This is an invalid fact that is not stated in the passage. 3 says low energy is a symptom. Undernutrition is caused due to deficiencies in energy. So low energy is a part of undernutrition, or is a part of the symptoms caused by undernutrition. Option C is the correct choice. All right. Passage 4. On the basis of the above passage, the following inferences have been made. So the first few questions, as you can tell, are inferences, and so far questions have been easy. Change in world climate would influence the functioning of many ecosystems. By the way, ये ecosystem, climate change, health, इस पे बहुत सारे passages आते हैं in the exam. This is a common thing that UPSC usually targets in terms of the topics. So climate change will impact ecosystems, and there would be health impacts, some of which would be beneficial. So this is new, right? Some health impacts would be beneficial, such as reduction in wintertime deaths, and might reduce some diseases or disease transmitting mosquitoes, but basically some diseases. So overall, scientists consider health impacts to be bad. Overall climate change health impacts are bad. All right. Let's look at which of these inferences are valid. One says Each year in temperate countries, some people die because of seasonal cold. Now, let's find whether we have evidence for this sentence. Each year in temperate countries. We are told here some beneficial impacts of health. We'll check those impacts. For example, milder winters would reduce the seasonal wintertime peak deaths. So, reduce seasonal wintertime peak deaths suggests that some people die in temperate countries. So exactly what is stated in the passage, because of seasonal cold weather. This is a seasonal element. So since it's a seasonal element, we can use the words each year. These are acceptable words, correct? So one is a textbook inference, one is a valid inference. Two says higher temperatures lead to increases in population of mosquitoes. This should be may lead to decrease. Higher temperatures may lead to decreases. This would have been correct, but lead to increases is invalid based on the information in the passage. So A is the correct choice for question number 4. All right, let's look at the next set. These set of questions, 4 passages, 4 items. This changes. Sometimes UPSC has asked 6 passages, 6 items, sometimes 3 passages, 7 items based on how many questions, how many passages. This is important because while solving the entire paper, you can get a quick estimate about how much time that verbal or passage section is going to take. Especially if you're going to be selective कि मैं 10 ही पैसेजेस सॉल्व करूंगा या मैं लिमिटेड पैसेजेस सॉल्व करूंगा बाकी सारे मैथ्स रीजनिंग के क्वेश्चन सॉल्व करूंगा समथिंग ऑफ दैट नेचर देन these instructions are going to be valuable. All right. So imbalanced diets, we are told here we are looking for assumptions. By the way, just a moment, let me define assumptions for all of us. uh, I've discussed this in class also, but please make a record. Let's say A tells B, go to the market and buy vegetables. All right. So let's say this is one passage or one statement. So from this, we can make one valid assumption would be B knows the way to the market. B knows the way to the market. Now, this is a valid assumption because, especially because, and this is why I tell all the students to be very careful and choose specific words for all your decisions. This is a valid assumption because the market is stated in the original passage. So since A is telling B go to the market, it's something that it's specific. It's using the article the. It's something you can point to. So this tells us B knows the way to the market. Uh, this would be a valid assumption. Now let me quickly tell you which could be an invalid assumption. So let's say B works for A. B is a subordinate of A, something like that. All of this would be invalid. If this had said ordered, then something like this, B may work for A, could be possible, right? But as it stands, we can't say B works for A, this or B is a subordinate of A. This would be an invalid assumption. What you want to remember from the assumption question is, unlike an inference question, the benefit of an assumption question is, notice A tells B go to the market and buy vegetables. ये valid assumption है. Sorry, B knows the way to the market. ये valid assumption है from this statement. Go to the market and buy vegetables. Now, since we know this could be a valid assumption, we can check. Unlike an inference question or other question types, in an assumption question, we can do a quick check whether the option we are selecting is right or wrong. And it's an easy test. If I add the word not here, B does not B does not know the way to the market, right? Then the original passage stops making sense. So, simply put, a valid assumption, which is this, there is another way to phrase this not wala test, does not wala test. Remember it, everyone. A valid assumption, if it's negated, the passage gets negated. All right, this is going to be useful. I'll show you this using, or I'll illustrate this using these questions. Okay. So we are looking for assumptions. Imbalanced diets are responsible for greatest mortality. Environment, the food we eat is responsible for greenhouse emissions. Uses a lot of freshwater resources. So what we eat is affecting our health and is affecting the environment. This is what the first assumption is. The food we eat is neither healthy nor sustainable. Now notice this. I can check the validity of this assumption by simply removing these words. राइट आई टोल्ड यू कि नॉट ऐड करने से या नॉट हटाने से, द वर्ड नॉट या नेगेशन, ऐड करने से या हटाने से वी कैन टेल वेदर अ assumption is valid or not. Now if I said the food we eat is healthy and sustainable, this would negate the passage. The passage would stop making sense. So I know for sure statement 1 is a valid assumption. This test of adding the word not or removing the word not is really important, especially because we can treat assumption questions just like we can treat crux or summary questions or main point questions as our strength. Inference questions or strengthen the argument, weaken the argument questions are usually tend to be trickier than these questions because of this test. The current food consumption patterns negatively impact ecosystems. So if I say don't negatively impact, then this idea that there are greenhouse gas emissions occurring because of the food we eat would be negated or invalidated. So I know statement 1 and 2 both are valid assumptions. C is the right choice. Let's look at the next question. Here, main threat to maintaining progress of human development is unsustainability of production and consumption patterns. We rely heavily on fossil fuels. Our resources are finite. Human development, if it's to be sustainable, some developed countries are trying to expand recycling, trying to make human development sustainable, but cost is hampering this. Developed countries need to support developing countries. We know the passage in general. I've marked exact words which will help us figure out the main point. You can have a slight difference between what I'm marking and maybe what you marked in the exam. That's okay. But be sure to identify the main point before you proceed to the question. Here, the question is general. It's a factual question. Unsustainability in production pattern is due to which of the following? So, heavy dependence on fossil fuels. We are told rely heavily on fossil fuels. Limited availability of resources. Our resources are finite. Expansion of recycling is a possible solution. This is a solution, right? This is not cause, right? So statement 3 would be invalid. Those students who have gone with D probably solved it in a hurry. I know some students have gone with option D in this case. All right. So fairly easy question. We are looking for inferences again in this question. Question 13. Some triumphant birds live in polar regions. They need to migrate to warmer regions. We know about migrations as a concept. But in recent years, we are told some unanticipated genetic changes. So these birds have some genetic change and their flying capability has been declining and is expected to continue. So their capacity to fly or migrate over longer distances is being reduced. All right. Now I said 3 questions were tricky. I think question 13 can be considered tricky because of options 2 and 3. First, let's go to option 1. This is easy. If these birds don't develop measures to counter adversarial genetic changes, they have some genetic changes and their capability is declining, expected to continue. They face likelihood of extinction. Likelihood is really important. It's not saying they will 100% get extinct. There is a chance, right? And we are told this word I forgot to mark. This migration is linked to survival. Correct? It's based on survival. So likelihood of extinction is valid. If they don't migrate, they may get extinct. So 1 is valid. Now let's look at statement 2. Over the past few years, some of the triumphant birds would not have flown back to polar regions because of limited flying ability. Now we are told in recent years, some unanticipated genetic changes are reducing flying capabilities, declining, continuing to do so. Right now, let's say they need to, we'll just say randomly, they need to fly 1,000 kilometers from point A to point B and back. Correct? Now we are told this is declining and expected to continue. Now, suppose their actual capacity to fly was, I'm just making this up to tell you because I think options 2 and 3 are a little tricky. Okay. So let's say these birds' ka capacity to fly was 1500 kilometers. Correct? We don't know. So my point is, some birds would not have flown back tells us two things according to statement 2. It's definitely their capacity is definitely declined or reduced, and it's reduced such that they cannot fly back. They cannot go from point B to point A again. This we can't state from the passage. If it's declined, if it's reduced, to what degree has it reduced? 1300 kilometers, 1050 kilometers, we don't know that. Correct? So we can't categorically say that some birds would not have flown back. This would be an invalid inference because we don't know to what degree it has declined. Now, the other thing which makes this question a little tricky, unless Tramba birds develop an ability to live in the polar regions, they will be extinct. Now, will be extinct is not like likelihood. Likelihood said chance hai extinction ka. So Will says 100% extinction would occur in this case. This would be an invalid statement. We cannot state that 100% extinction is possible. So this word, and unless they do it, is why statement 3 is invalid. The right answer here is option A. Right. Let's see the next one. Which of the following inferences can be made? This passage was a little tricky to read. Okay, so uh, I've marked certain words, but what the passage essentially means is when mankind developed this concept of wealth, along with that, there was a moral structure which developed, right? The morals about wealth were don't be too luxurious, don't indulge yourself too much. Instead, it emphasized hard work. So even though you're wealthy, you should work hard, you should be frugal, right? And these values were there in the world, but the passage and the author are saying that the world was not corrupted by wealth. It was not corrupted by wealth. Over the past 30 years, much of that has been shredded, and then we know what the author will generally say. Social norms encourage frugality have been undermined. These norms have been removed. So now we don't encourage frugality, we in fact embrace maximalism. Most rampant decadence for financial decadence. Decadence essentially mean people are using and misusing money and spending it, etc. Right? So old values of being frugal, of spending little money, saving money, working hard, those values have vanished. Instead, we are now trying to be as decadent, to live in debt, live in the moment, so on and so forth. So I think those of you who find such passages trickier, let me just mention this one thing that you have to observe. I've mentioned this in class. Some of you may have forgotten it. The first factor we should look for is length of sentences. This is important. The second factor we should look out for is difficult words, right? And the third factor is new terms or concepts. Now, we look for these three factors really quickly, right? So if I look at this passage, before I decide to solve this passage, what I'll do is I'll read, okay, I'm being asked about inferences. And then I quickly scan this passage. And by quickly, I'm saying less than 10 seconds. Because what I'm looking for is, first thing I'm looking for sentence length in general, correct? I'm looking for sentence length in general. And the second thing I'm looking for is, are there difficult words? Difficult words such as, let's say, practical gospel, that emphasized hard work. Practical gospel is not really difficult, but it's not usually something we'll hear in a UPSC passage. UPSC does use really difficult language once in a while, but not regularly. And the third thing that I look for is there a completely new concept? What UPSC may do is, suppose this year someone has won the Nobel Prize in chemistry and it's some new term. It could be a really small passage, but it may use those terms. So there may be new terms. So I quickly, in less than 10 seconds, do the scan, and then I can decide whether to solve a passage or not. This is really important for all of you all who are deciding to be selective about which passages to solve or not. Okay, let's come back to the passage. Passage was about this value of being frugal, of saving has gone away. It has been undermined in today's society. So let's look at one. Ever since its existence, money has ruined lives. This is incorrect. We are told by and large, it has not corrupted wealth in the past. In the past, it did not, it wasn't corrupting. So ever since its existence, money has ruined lives is invalid, right? This is an invalid inference. B says, breaking down of moral institutions which supported economic prudence. The social norms have been undermined, right? This is responsible for encouragement of debt and living in the moment, etc., etc. So statement 2 is a valid inference. Option B is the correct choice. Okay. So remember what all I discussed so far. I've explained inferences, explained assumptions, I've explained the strategy that you have to choose to select or skip a particular passage. Let's look at the next question. We're looking for assumptions. Biggest contributing factors to food waste is overall lack of visibility in the supply chain. This has been elaborated throughout the passage. It makes it extremely difficult to spot surpluses and eventually leading to waste. So, supply chain, we know it includes multiple people like farmers, packagers, distributors, so on and so forth. So, you can't see what's happening in the supply chain. This leads to demand supply mismatch, surplus, and eventually waste. Passage is fairly easy. Let's look at option one. Statement one, standardization will improve forecasting. So, will improve is extreme, like 100% it will improve. This is incorrect. Obviously, the passage does not say. And second is the problem is not standardization. Problem is lack of visibility, right? These systems are rarely interoperable, often analog, making it virtually impossible to see what's happening. So standardization, no visibility is the problem. So one is invalid for saying standardization and will improve. Two says product surpluses can cause loss for manufacturers. Makes it extremely difficult, leading to surpluses, eventually waste. So obviously this would lead to some manufacturers going through losses. They're producing surplus and those items are going waste. B is a valid inference. Let's see the next one. We are looking for implications. Another way to say inferences. I've marked a little more words here just to be clear. Ecologists have, we are told in the, this is another question that could be tricky for students. So let's first go through the first sentence also. We are told people are planning to plant trees based on the idea that afforestation along river banks would recharge groundwater. We are told now, these words are important. Ecologists have pointed out that trees don't necessarily make rivers flow. These words, very important, right? Very, very important. Instead, restoring river flow would be the first step. So, experts or ecologists are saying plants, those trees, planting of trees along the river banks may not help, but may not is the crucial phrase here. Okay. And we are told to restore river flow, water management policies improve karo, dams ko के management को improve करो, etc., etc. These words. The amount of water we use, we won't be able to use unless we change how we use water. Let's look at one. Recharging of groundwater tables can be achieved by planting trees along the banks of rivers. Now we are told here to plant trees, uh, afforestation, this could recharge groundwater tables, right? And ecologists have said this is not necessarily true. These words are very important. Not necessarily true. So here, can is acceptable. This is one of the most trickier questions in the paper. The words that would not be acceptable, recharging of groundwater tables, will be achieved. Because can says in theory may be possible. It's a possibility, can be done. But will would be invalid. So can is acceptable. Our upstream water use and extraction is so high that it has impacted flow. Unless we make changes in the amount of water, we won't be able to. So unless we do this, we won't be able to tell us that extraction is so high it has impacted the flow of rivers niche. Uh, all right. So C is the right choice. I expect question 22 to go wrong for many students. It's an acceptable mistake. And the real challenge is not the second. I can see that some students have a problem with this already, but it's not the second statement, but can be achieved is problematic. It's acceptable, but sort of problematic. What is definitely not acceptable would be will or certainly anything that expresses 100% guarantee that planting trees will help is not acceptable. All right. So C is the right choice in this case. Let's look at the next question. The massive economic fallout of the pandemic told us that we should go beyond simple foreign policy and of geopolitics and look at public health, climate change. India's interests need to be realigned to emphasize linkages between traditional diplomacy and new economic diplomacy. So, according to the author, the new economic diplomacy should focus on development and human security. All right. I expect this question also to be a little tricky because of the first statement, but eventually, options की वजह से people will reach the right answer. Because यहाँ पे in global affairs, ये words passage में नहीं mentioned, right? These aren't mentioned in the passage. But we can find them here or we can infer them here, correct? We're looking for inferences. We are told human health and development needs more attention today, right? We can say today. So massive economic fallout of pandemic, imperative to expand foreign policy beyond traditional to more complex things like public health and climate change. So human health needs more attention today globally because this is not specific to India. This is talking about in general. So since it's speaking about things in general, I can use the words in global affairs. Correct? So the first statement is valid. Second statement, India can employ development cooperation objectives only through diplomacy. Invalid. Third statement, development cooperation and human security should be prioritized over mere geopolitics. Should be prioritized over mere matlab simply geopolitics. Ye opinions, mere and should be prioritized, have not been expressed by the author. So 2 and 3 are invalid. The right answer is option C, 1 only. Right? Let's see the next one. A democratic system has to ensure that we are looking for assumptions, by the way. A democratic system has to ensure that social development is in tune with equality, right? So, democracy should ensure equality. All citizens must be able to avail opportunities. Very easy passage, right? Now, let's look at the first statement. Socio-economic development of the people strengthens social democracy, right? Socio-economic development strengthens social democracy. A democracy or a democratic system has to ensure, it has to do this, that social development should reflect equality. So socio-economic development strengthens democracy. The only word here that might be tricky for students is social democracy. So very easy test, right? All I have to do is, so socio-economic development of the people, यहाँ पे we add the words does not strengthen. If we added the words does not strengthen between people and strengthens, we'll know that this statement would become invalid. That tells me statement 1 has to be a valid assumption. So 1 is valid. 2 says a system which lacks availability of universal and compulsory education cannot be called democratic. This sounds extreme, right? And many students have found this problematic based on the answers, right? But if you notice, we are told it has to ensure, right? They must also be enabled, must reach all. So cannot be called democratic is valid. Correct. C is the correct choice. Again, you can say can still be called democratic. And if you instead of cannot, if you make it can still be called democratic, passage ही गलत हो जाएगा. So we can try this negation test with assumptions and it makes our answer that much more accurate. So that's why I feel generally crux, main point, and assumption questions can be our strength. Summary questions also, depending on students. All right. We are told RBI is because of presence of unrated exposures. So banks are giving loans which are not rated or which are not categorized, this leads to information barriers. Since they're not categorized or rated, RBI doesn't know whether it's a good loan or a bad loan. The banks also don't necessarily know whether it's a good loan or a bad loan. So, because of this, RBI is raising the risk of weights for such exposures. So, risk of weights is being raised means if it says it's a unrated exposure, we'll call if it's UX, right? If it notices a bank has an unrated exposure, it'll categorize this as more weighted. Like, let's say this is more problematic. This is what RBI is doing. So if a bank has this in its uh, in his in his balance sheet, then we can say that it has a problematic exposure. The reason why it's doing this is to make sure that banks become more stable, secure. We know this. All right. So let's look at one. To more accurately assess the credit, what are the possible reasons why RBI is doing this? To more accurately assess the credit, because it's an information barrier. It's an unrated exposure. They can't measure exactly that situation. So, more accurately assess credit is valid. Discouraging banks to give loans to unrated borrowers. So, by raising the risk, right, this is telling banks that, by the way, you're giving risky loans. Stop giving risky loans. So, second statement could have been challenging to some students. So, but it's not. If you notice, it's present in all the options. So not much of worry. So 1 and 2 are valid. 3 says exposure of large domestic systematically important banks is actually this statement is invalid because the passage does not speak of large domestic systematically important banks. All right. So look at statement 3. The reason why UPSC does this is a previous year question. The reason why UPSC does this is that statement 3 is something that we know to be factually true. आपके GS1 के पढ़ाई से you'll know कि statement 3 is factually true, but it's not stated in the passage, so this is invalid. And by then we can already choose option C, but to overcome information barrier is directly stated. So option 4 is valid. So the right answer here is C, 1, 2, and 4 only. Okay. Best implied, we're looking for implications, inferences. Emotion is important for human life. Emotional excess is not important. It would lead to downfall of society. Then we are told being wise, putting wisdom into our emotions, being wise about emotions is a part of many ancient Indian texts. So ancient is not used. I'm just explaining here. Human society stands on the brink of an emotional storm, not only in India but also all over the world. So basically, author ये recommend कर रहा है कि we should put wisdom into our emotions. We can use Indian texts, but generally we should put wisdom into our emotions. So one says the idea of putting wisdom in emotions is not a new one. It's the subject of many Indian texts, right? So this is true. Statement 1 is valid and implied. It's actually stated in the passage. Statement 2 says it would be beneficial to mankind to remove emotions. So this is extreme. Beneficial to remove emotions has not been discussed. Emotions are important, has been told. So A is the right choice. Really easy question. Let's move to question 34. On the basis of the above passage, following assumptions have been made. Let's look at the passage. A simultaneous nationwide election could push the voter turnout. So, voter turnout, uh, one nation, one election has been discussed in news all the time. By the way, what is discussed this year in news or the year before in news will feature in this year's passages that you see in the exam. So, again, like I said, remember not to use your own knowledge or opinion. Make sure that you read the passage for what it is and based on the passage, try and answer the question. Simultaneous nationwide election could push up the voter turnout because it will help address voter fatigue. Voters get bored. हर साल election हो रहे हर 2 साल election हो रहे क्या चल रहा है पता नहीं. So that voter fatigue element that you would have read about would may reduce based on simultaneous nationwide election. So usually could push up इसलिए may reduce. And this is usually observed in urban settings. So let's look at statement 1. Rural voters are not subject to apathy in voting. So rural voters are not subject. This is problematic. This is voter fatigue is usually observed in urban. Usually observed से हम लोग यहाँ पे assumption पूछ रहा है question, but for a moment usually observed से हम लोग ये infer कर सकते हैं कि it may be also a rural phenomenon. कभी कभी रूरल वोटर्स के साथ भी ये हो सकता है. So rural voters are not subject is invalid. It's an invalid assumption. If I remove the word not also doesn't make any difference to the passage because rural voters के बारे में the author has not stated this. Let's look at the second statement. Frequent elections can bring election fatigue. Right now, if I say cannot bring election fatigue, तो ये help address voter fatigue negate हो जाएगा. Right? This will get invalidated if I add the word not. That tells me statement 2 is a valid assumption. Let's move to question 41. This is from the next set. Ways to ensure data resources owned by the public. This also could have been a little tricky passage because of the fourth statement here, but the options somewhat make it easier. Okay. So let's see. Experts argue that data should be treated as public resource. It should be collected within a jurisdiction, should first and foremost belong to that jurisdiction. So it should be in that jurisdiction, should belong to that jurisdiction. This applies to physical world data like agriculture, weather patterns, borders of the country, etc., and humans also, people who reside in that country. So how do we do this? So one is jurisdiction based ownership. ये तो यहाँ पे I've marked. It's a part of the main point. One is valid. Two says building capacity to extract and collate data. If you're told here, even if authorities do not have the capacity to extract and collect data. So even if you don't have capacity, still we should protect data. So building capacity is actually opposite of what is stated in the passage, right? So invalid based on this line in the passage. All right. 3 says, so here 1 is valid and 2 is invalid, right? So we know that this is gone, this is gone, this option is gone. We can by now select option A, correct? Make sure that for these multiple statement questions, you use the options. I'm going through each option, each statement here. I can't call these options. I'm calling them statements because these are options right now. But I'm going through each statement because I want to be sure that we discuss each word and how to validate it and negate it. But जभी भी you find the options useful, jump to those options and see if you can reduce your workload. Here we know 1 is valid and 2 is definitely invalid. So this would negate these. And then you can just check 4 quickly. It's a little tricky, but there is no other option. So you can quickly mark option A. Separating the capacity to extract data and the ownership of data. We are told that even if you do not have the capacity to collect or store that data, you should make sure that this data is protected. So separating capacity to extract, clearly the government does not have the capacity to extract. We are told even if authorities do not have the capacity to extract. So if you separate the capacity to extract from ownership of data, that's okay. This means I'll separate it like this. Ownership should be of government or people in short. Capacity to extract can be private, right? So this is allowed. This is valid. So this makes statement 4 valid. I know statement 4 was problematic for students, but remember it like this. Capacity to extract can belong to private sector based on this statement. And ownership of data is the property of the people or the government, right? So A is the right choice. Public data fund has nowhere been mentioned. So 2 and 3 are invalid. All right. Let's see this question 42. We are looking for assumptions. More inclusive international trade and online commerce we are asked to do. Digital latecomers have the advantage of learning from mistake of front runners. Digital latecomers मतलब वो लोग जो बाद में आए हैं to set up this legal framework to make it more inclusive. So these developing countries have the possibility to build a digital economy with better privacy and data protection. Since they're latecomers, they have the capacity to make better systems because they've learned from the mistakes of others, right? Let's look at this is also a previous year question, by the way. Though developed countries established data protection systems much before. This idea of they developed set them up much before. This has not been stated. They have been, if statement 1 had said, though many instead of all, यहाँ पे many word लिखा नहीं है तो वो स्टेटमेंट वन ये बोल रहा है कि सारे डेवलप कंट्रीज, दैट वुड बी इनकरेक्ट. So though many developed countries established data protection systems before, these systems were were somewhat faulty. Were somewhat faulty. If you made all these changes that are marked here, many developed countries कर देते, ये much word हटा देते, somewhat faulty बोल देते. So it would have been a valid assumption. But as it stands with these words as they are, one is invalid. Okay. Let's look at statement two. A data regulation system which prioritizes the rights of individuals will promote international trade. So we are told more inclusive international trade by compatible legal framework or a more data protection, more stronger data protection system. So statement two is a valid assumption. All I have to do is will not promote, यहाँ पे will not कर देंगे तो the passage will stop making sense. So this is a valid assumption. Let's look at this inference question, question 43. An interdisciplinary approach is required to understand and mitigate impacts of climate extremes. Human society requires ecosystem services. ये आपको ecology पढ़ के पता चलेगा क्या है. Ecosystem services are those services provided by the ecosystem. More than 3/4 of terrestrial surface is currently used by humans, and we have a lot of managed ecosystems. So this affects the response of social ecosystems. All right. Fairly easy passage. I've marked the main point. Let's look at A. Ecosystems and society are closely coupled and are both equally affected. This word is unacceptable. Not discussed in the passage. Invalid. We can learn, let's look at option B. We can learn about impacts from past extreme events to continuously improve management ecosystems and increase adaptive capacity. So we can learn about impacts from past extreme events not discussed in the passage. Invalid. Let's look at D. Alternative income possibilities reduce dependency. Nowhere stated. So options were really easy. The only tricky part about this question, somewhat, I would categorize this as moderate because someone has just asked. Here, if you notice, the amount of information in the options you have to go through is a little long, so it can be a little problematic. Let's look at C. To ensure human well-being in the face of extreme climate extremes, we are told here human society fundamentally depends on ecosystem services. Correct? So ensure human well-being is important. We need to use these ecosystem services across spatial and temporal scales. It's a process that intensified millennia ago, but this is relevant in recent times as well. We have an impact on social ecological systems, and that is what is mentioned here, SES, right? So option C, another previous year question, option C is a valid inference. Okay, we're looking for assumptions here. Globalization of Indian economy has dramatically influenced social life in India, expansion of the middle class. We are told what has happened, which specific class in India has benefited by globalization. Many scholars argue that globalization has been detrimental to women, but many respondents, like a survey, यहाँ पे respondents बोल रहे तो शायद ये survey से आया है, but many respondents identify greater opportunities. So even though we are told that the globalization of Indian economy has influenced or expanded the middle class, the impact on women has been here, from here till here, has been somewhat confusing or mixed. Correct? Keeping this idea in mind, let's go to options. Let's look at one. Globalization has increased overall incomes. Overall nahi, bus expansion of middle class has been written. Overall incomes would be invalid. 2 says Indian middle class has obtained most benefits out of globalization. So it is said expansion of the middle class is said to have occurred as a consequence. Based on this ethnographic lower middle class families, there seem to be an apparent paradox. So we can't, middle class, lower middle class, both have been discussed. Most benefits out of globalization is unknown, because the reason why we don't go with, firstly, there's no option which says 2 and 3. The reason why we don't go with option 2 is most benefits is not the same as expanded. Right? What did I tell you? Just like a bar graph question, we look at the graph and we decide whether an question or option is correct or incorrect. If we look at the passage, expansion likha hai. Expansion is not the same as most benefits, right? So 2 is invalid, 1 is invalid. 3 says the impact of globalization on women is not clear. This is correct based on this mixed bag of information they've given in second half of the passage, right? So option B is the right choice, which is 3 only. Let's see the next one. This is the next set of questions. We are looking for the crux of the passage. Crux is basically the main point of the author. This is usually a easier question type. If you notice here, the options are again really long, so becomes close to moderate but not difficult. We are told society is to be serious about slowing or reversing global environmental trends. If we are serious, what should we do? Social sciences must step forward more forcefully to inform understanding. So, social science should help us understand these problems or these systems. Social science can help us explain how these systems unfold and interconnect across space. And that's the role social sciences should play. So I've essentially marked the main point of the author. A says, now what you have to do for main point question, which is crux or summary question, is notice the words best implies. इसका मतलब ये है कि there could be two possible main points or two possible summaries. We are discussing main point right now. So you want to make sure that you've selected the best option. So if A, you read A and you think A is a good crux of the passage, you still have to read B, C, and D carefully to check whether B is better or C is better or D is better, right? So let's look at A. Unless social ecological systems are better understood through social sciences must step forward. So must step forward helps me use the word unless. Okay? Unless we do this, we cannot reverse global environmental trends. This is about slowing or reversing global environmental trends. So option A is a good enough crux. Let's check whether there are better options than this. B says transcending dichotomy is necessary. The nature society dichotomy, the split between nature and society, not stated in the passage. D is invalid. C says to tackle the environmental problems which society is facing, social sciences must. So till here, the option is fine. Must be put at the forefront of education. Matlab, we should put physics and mathematics behind. We should put social sciences at the forefront. This is not stated by the author. So B and C are invalid. Let's look at D. If society is serious about reversing global trends, the future of social ecological systems must be forecasted or must be predicted, not discussed in the passage. Invalid. Also, it doesn't capture what role social sciences are supposed to play. They are supposed to play an educative role. So option D does not capture that. So A is the best possible choice. We are looking for assumptions. Can a democracy avoid being a welfare state for long? Another previous year passage. We are told there is a built-in tension between markets and democracy. Markets reward individual initiative and skill and may also lift many from society. But some people never get the opportunity to develop skill. So some people in a market-oriented society never get the opportunity. Then the last sentence is markets may be able to help even unskilled people. So even unskilled people can be helped by the market. But capitalism has always witnessed bursts of unemployment. So the author is saying that a democracy cannot avoid being a welfare state because the markets are good, they're beneficial, but some people are always left out. The democracy has to take over, or the state has to take, the welfare state has to take over, right? So according to, if you are to make a broad inference from the passage, the author is saying ki along with market you'll need a welfare state to provide for all. Okay, so we are being asked about assumptions. Let's look at one. Modern democracies rely on the market forces to enable them to be welfare states. Modern democracies rely on market forces, not stated. To enable them to be welfare states, not stated. One is an invalid assumption. Two says markets ensure sufficient economic growth necessary for democracies to be effective. Sufficient economic growth has not been stated. It's an invalid assumption. If I say don't ensure sufficient economic growth, since sufficient economic growth has not been discussed, this won't have any impact, right? Sufficiency of economic growth not discussed. Three is a valid assumption. Government programs are needed for those left behind in economic growth. A democracy cannot avoid being a welfare state. At some stage, the democracy has to take over and act as a welfare state. If I said are not needed, यहाँ पे ये part of the passage would have been invalidated, right? So statement 3 is valid. B is the right answer. Let's look at question 53. Deforestation and denudation will ultimately lead to which of the following? We are told it will increase to such an extent that agriculture, which is the mainstay of our people, will gradually become impossible. Right? If we don't take care of the forests, if we allow deforestation to occur, uh, it will increase to such an extent that agriculture, which is the mainstay, which is the main occupation, will gradually become impossible. So strong words are used. Rajasthan is given as an example. All right. So let's look at the first statement. Depletion of soil resources. This is valid. This is discussed in the passage. Shortage of land for the common man. This idea that land will fall short, not discussed in the passage. Right? Is not discussed as a cause. We are told what will ultimately lead to deforestation. And so what is the cause? Right? Shortage of land for common man is not a cause, and lack of water for cultivation is right. So C 1 and 3 only. Really easy question. All right. Let's look at question 61. This is the second to last set. We are looking for inferences. There have been major breakthroughs in genetic technologies, and because of these, there's a wealth of genetic diversity data. So we have a lot of genetic data now. So we obviously have a lot of agronomic data or traits of plants available with us. Data on several major crops have been generated, including not only cultivated lines, but also wild species and land races. So data of agricultural crops, wild species, and land races is now with us, and we can use this data, right? This is what is suggested. So let's look at the inferences. A says modern plant breeding and genetic engineering are complementary methods to improve crop yield. Unacceptable. Nowhere improving crop yield discussed. Invalid. High output uh, will help increase efficiency and reduce breeding costs. So high output will reduce breeding costs. Not discussed. Both of these phrases make options A and B invalid. Let's look at D. We must continue to make advancements in genomic technologies to improve quality of GM crops. Quality of GM crops not discussed in the passage. Invalid inference. C is the right choice. Data-driven insights. So these breakthroughs and this data is supposed to help us. These insights can benefit agriculture. So this is a valid inference into genetic molecular basis of agronomic traits. All of this is stated in the passage. What is added and is a valid inference is can benefit agriculture. Option C is a valid inference. Let's see the next one. We're looking for assumptions here. People are going to invest in education whenever they're granted economic freedom to fully enjoy its benefits. So this first statement somewhat captures the main point. To invest in education, there should be economic freedom. Basically, if you're living from paycheck to paycheck or you don't have money, you cannot invest in you cannot invest in education. When the government decides to tax higher income of educated individuals at even higher rates, it makes very little sense to invest in educating oneself further. So if you tax higher income of educated individuals, education does not seem like a good investment or a viable use of money. That's the author's opinion. Let's look at assumptions. One says lower tax rates in a country invariably translate into greater investments in higher education. These words invariably translates uh, essentially are trying to say certainly leads to, right? So this is extreme. It's not stated in the passage. One is invalid. Two says investment in education ensures their economic freedom. Investment ensures economic freedom, not guaranteed. Right. So 1 and 2 are invalid. 3 says ensures, just like invariably translates, is extreme. Right. If I wasn't clear with options 1 and 2. Option 3 says economic freedom has a positive impact on building human capital. So whenever they are granted economic freedom, then you will invest in education. So positive impact on building up human capital. All right. So statement 3 is a valid assumption if I said does not have a positive impact, the passage would stop making sense. Right. So that tells me that 3 is a valid assumption. Let's look at question 63. We are looking at assumptions again. We are told that uh, despite our foreign reserves being high, many problems that are leading to the drop in the value of the rupee cannot be addressed by the government. Factors that are weakening the rupee are higher crude oil prices, tightening global monetary conditions, geopolitical uncertainty, global food shortages. So in short, these are external factors not in the control of Indian government. All right, let's look at statement 1. High foreign reserves cannot completely insulate the rupee from uh, external shocks. So just because you have high foreign reserves, you're not completely insulated. You're still affected by global economy. That's what the passage was saying. One is a valid assumption, I can say. Can completely insulate, the passage would be invalid. So one is a valid assumption. 2 says global food shortages cause a major drop in the value of the rupee. Global food shortages acceptable. Major drop invalid. It's a cause. Global food shortage is a cause. But let's say, if I was to oversimplify this, let's say this is cause A, cause B, cause C, and cause D. Out of all these, the reason why I'm marking this is I know many students have gone with C. Uh, if I have 4 causes given A, B, C, and D, I can't say which of them is the most major cause. Right? I can't say A is the most major cause or B is the most major cause. Unless the author has told us, we can't use the word major here. So, statement 1 is valid. A is the right answer. Let's look at question 71. This is the last question from the paper, last verbal question from the paper, passage question. Possible ways in which rule of law can be protected. Right? A fact-based question from the passage or possibly an inference question. One of the major challenges to the protection of rule of law and human rights is inability of formal justice system to deliver speedy and affordable justice. So we know what the passage is about. The first line essentially captures it. It's the main point of the author. So speedy delivery of justice and affordability of justice is essential for rule of law. So for which we need to modernize our judicial infrastructure. If we don't do this, constitutional ideal of access to justice would be defeated. If we don't provide justice in a speedy and affordable way, this ideal of access to justice would be invalidated in the constitution. Let's look at 1. Taking appropriate steps for providing accommodation for all possible judges. This is nowhere stated in the passage that accommodation is a problem. 1 is invalid. 2 says increasing the number of vacancies for judges in district courts. Vacancies are discussed in the passage, but the vacancies are discussed as need for filling up existing vacancies. So existing vacancies are only empty. Many of the existing vacancies are empty. So we can't say there is need for more vacancies. So increasing would be invalid. 1 and 2 are invalid. 3 is valid by making access to justice more affordable, equitable. This is the main point of the author, and this is valid. D is the right choice for this question. All right. So I just want to bring the discussion to an end. But before I do so, I want to mention a few things. Remember that for our accuracy, and throughout my classes also, and throughout this discussion also, I have tried to justify this very thing. I've tried to justify this very thing is that uh, you want to make sure, just a moment, sorry about that disturbance. You want to make sure that you ensure that you are methodical. right? If you notice this entire discussion throughout the marking of the words and specific words is to ensure that our solving process is very methodical in nature, right? It's not going on autopilot. What is going to happen is the moment we start running out of time, we start solving passages on autopilot, or we just read them and we go back to our native method of solving these questions. That's actually not helpful. For the exam, we need to be methodical. Make sure you're methodical. Please leave in your doubts if I haven't been able to address these doubts, and I'd like to bring the discussion to an end. I hope it has been effective for all of you all. Let's see how you perform in the next Anubhav test. Thank you, and all the best to all of you all.